Chapter 27. Mr. Phelps' plane touched down at 15 minutes past 2 that afternoon on Dunkeswell airstrip, 256 metres above sea level, forming the northwest rim of the basin surrounding Dumpton. He'd been given instructions to meet at Wolford Chapel, approximately 1 mile south. These indiscriminate rendezvous were always perilous. He'd found himself the unwilling chief orchestrator in potentially his own demise. It was only his impeccable planning and attention to every conceivable detail that now kept his covert role as confidant to the Titan Chios hidden. Chios had recently made himself known to him as the father of Rika, effectively shortening all their lifespans considerably. It meant Chios was tying up loose ends. On saner occasions, Phelps had contemplated taking his own life to spare him the misery of indentured servitude, but hope kept him shackled. Instead, he now lived as 3 men. As Whitehall Chief of Staff, Titan No. 3 to Hyperion, and his most challenging and dangerous role as confidant of Chios's secret. His precarious existence had been tempered by small routine, with only his occasional hiatus into psychosis to keep him sane. In the balmy days of his youth, Mr. Phelps had foolishly taken a bride. His fervent need to indulge his predilection to kill creatively had made becoming a Titan scout necessary. His decision had immediately condemned her. What had first been his inordinate fondness for her had evolved into devotion. He'd been enraptured by how such a tender and trusting creature could live by his side in such precariously close proximity to her death. When the time had come, he'd murdered her himself. It had been an act of mercy, born out of his love for her. He'd disguised his benevolent gesture by killing a man from his staff and placing him in the bed alongside his wife for the benefit of the authorities. His only child, Monica, was now all that remained of his beloved. Mr. Phelps' black sedan pulled up behind another outside Wolford Chapel. He took the cobbled pathway canopied by large oaks to its entrance and stepped inside. The chapel's interior was ice cold and dank. Candles had been lit within, but did little to rouse the spirit. Sitting with his head bowed in the front left pew was a man he feared above all others. Taking a pew opposite, he stared forward, silently waiting. "My son, Rika," Chios whispered with a distinct underlying tone of anger, "lives." Mr. Phelps was not overly surprised. The boy was resourceful. "He must be located." There was a pause before Chios continued, "You're to kill him. Humanely." "Naturally," Mr. Phelps confirmed. "This concludes our business for all time." Chios rose and exited the chapel. Mr. Phelps waited until he heard Chios's car pull away from outside. Not realizing he had been holding his breath, he exhaled. Killing Rika would result in both the death of himself and, ultimately, Monica. Should he perform another act of mercy? He'd make it quick and painless for them both. But as he posed the question, he knew he couldn't take her life. So if Rika were to live, what were their collective chances for survival? Chios had been able to establish Rika was still alive, but he didn't know where, and he wouldn't have been able to divulge her secret, which meant it was highly probable he'd been compelled to establish this fact for himself. If Phelps could be certain only he and Chios knew of Rika's true parentage, he might gain some leverage. He spent the next 2 hours alone in the chapel until he'd exhausted a number of scenarios, all of which resulted in the same outcome, their ultimate demise. Chios must have known before entering the chapel that in asking him to kill his son, he was also expecting him to end his own life and that of his daughter. He made the only decision a man in his situation could. He would use Pilgrim to defeat Chios. But first, he thought, locking his fingers together and stretching his arms in front of him in repressed excitement, he would very gently tilt over the first domino in the chain. He pulled a penknife from his pocket and sliced a shallow cut across his palm. A bead of blood erupted, which he smeared. Lifting his palm to his face, he inhaled the heady scent of iron. He'd go directly to the church at Marylebone. He sat and swayed to the song in his head, moving his hands and head back and forth, allowing the moment to overwhelm him.